Hello, everyone. I'm Kellen Havikin with the Brownfield Ag Network, an anchor and reporter based in Nebraska. Today, we're going to talk about the drought monitor and the drought that the Corn Belt is experiencing. And to do that, Brian Fuchs, an author with the US Drought Monitor and with the National Drought Mitigation Center, joins us. Brian, always a pleasure to talk with you. And we're doing that at least this morning, where parts of the Corn Belt are receiving some moisture.
Yeah, the last few days we've had some of these overnight systems kind of working their way through the Corn Belt in the morning times. And again, in parts of eastern Nebraska, western Iowa this morning, a pretty decent line of some thunderstorms came through. I haven't heard much for damage, but a little bit of rain coming with that, up to a half inch, maybe a little bit more in places. And so that's, again, with where we're at this growing season, that's always a welcome sign.
Absolutely. And we'll talk maybe about the outlook of the forecast for some of these drought-ridden areas here in a few minutes. I want to talk about the latest drought monitor released today here at the end of June. What stuck out to you? What was kind of maybe the big shocker?
Well, what we really have seen, and again, we'll concentrate on the Corn Belt, is really in the central to eastern Corn Belt, just how much drought has developed here over the last month or so, and even with this week's release of the Drought Monitor, we see a lot of degradation from Indiana, Illinois, into Missouri and Iowa. Parts of Kansas and Nebraska as well. So that's kind of been the story over the last month or so, and it really came at a critical time too, as we're really trying to get that corn crop going and established before we hit some critical periods, and this has really put a damper on some of that.
Well, I know, and then we should mention that there's been some improvement to drought in the very western part of the Corn Belt through South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas. It looked like there was even some drought removal in those states.
Yeah, that's really been the the pattern that we've been in, that further west in the Corn Belt, western Nebraska, I mean, even into parts of central Nebraska, western South Dakota, northeast Colorado, western Kansas, there's been quite a bit of improvement. And like you said, even some removal of drought in those areas. And, that was based coming off of a winter where they also saw significant moisture in those areas. So not only are we seeing some of those grain crops doing pretty well, but also on the livestock side, those pasture and rangeland areas are doing quite well too.
Let's focus on the Eastern Corn Belt, Brian. What is? I mean, we're seeing Illinois and parts of Missouri seem to be getting the hardest hit right now, at least from what I've looked at the drought monitor. What stands out to you? What's been the biggest factor for that region?
Well, with today's release, what we're seeing is through much of Illinois into Missouri, we've seen this develop, like we've mentioned, this development of drought, but it's also intensified where now we see large swaths of severe drought, or D2 on the drought monitor, and that's extending all the way from western portions of Indiana through central Illinois and through much of northern and central Missouri. And even in some of those areas, we do see some pockets of extreme drought, or D3 on the drought monitor, and those have slowly been getting larger over the last month or so as well. And that's mainly in central Missouri through northeast Missouri and south east Iowa, where we're seeing that just kind of crossing the border into Illinois a little bit too. And then couple that with the long-term dryness that we've seen over eastern Nebraska and western Iowa, where extreme and exceptional drought are in place. You do see a lot of the Corn Belt being impacted, not only with drought, but drought now that's intensifying to more of those higher levels of drought that we show on the drought monitor, with that severe to extreme drought, not only popping up in more areas, but also expanding.
You know, when we look at the Eastern Corn Belt, the I states, right, the major corn producing states, we talk July being kind of the critical month for that crop with reproduction. How do you maybe measure the impact that drought in June has had in those areas on in terms of that corn crop?
Well, a lot of it will go back to soil moisture. So we know that through a lot of those areas, winter was was I won't say completely dry, but not necessarily a wet winter per se. And so that really dictated how much recharge of soil moisture was going to take place, especially deeper depths of the soil profile. And so with some of those areas not seeing that complete recharge of the soil coming into planting season, sure, we got the crop in good shape and didn't have to fight delays. Some of the delays were due to temperatures more so than anything. But the positive with that is this period of early development in that corn crop really forced that crop to extend those rooting systems down deep. And so not only did we get a good stand of corn established, but it was already tapping into some of that soil moisture. But then that dryness kind of set in here now in June. And, you know, we do talk about those critical periods mainly showing up in July, but again, it really is going to be dictated by how healthy that crop is going into July. And, you know, right now, these spotty showers that we're seeing, some areas are picking up much needed precipitation, but as we've mentioned, others are getting missed out on those. And so it is kind of setting the stage of what it can mean going into pollination when we already are seeing some of these fields being stressed. We see leaves curling, starting to see some of those leaf tips firing. And, you know, that really is setting the stage again of how important it's going to be to see precipitation in early July as we do hit that pollination stage.
Brian, two other regions I want to quick touch on, Upper Midwest and Delta. What are you seeing there?
So in the Upper Midwest, there has been some dryness as well, not as problematic. And again, cooler temperatures up in that area have definitely helped. But we are seeing some moderate drought through much of Wisconsin, Minnesota, touching into even portions of the Dakotas. Down in the Delta, just some recent dryness here lately. Over the last couple of weeks, we've seen not only that dryness pick up, but temperatures increasing. This week's drought monitor showed a little bit expansion of what we call abnormally dry, or that precursor to drought, through more of the Delta region. So again, the dryness is on their minds down there, all the way into portions of East Texas as well, where up to this point, they have had pretty regular precipitation. But again, coupled that with increasing temperatures, which are common this time of year, and then you start decreasing some of that precipitation, and those impacts will start appearing quite rapidly there as well.
Okay, give me your expectation for the outlook. I know we've got storm systems forecast in place through the end of June to start July through the holiday, but what's your outlook?
So when we start looking at some of the more near term, we are seeing that, like you mentioned, we are in a fairly active pattern right now. And looking at, you know, just over the next week, it is showing some favorable conditions all the way from Nebraska through northern Missouri, southern Iowa, almost all of Illinois, Illinois, Indiana, and the eastern portions of the Corn Belt. They're showing a pretty high likelihood of widespread several inch amount precipitation totals through that period. And, you know, as we just were talking, as we slowly are making our way into July, these types of forecasts or outlooks are really going to be what we're paying attention to, especially as we hit those key critical periods. Some of the areas that are not seeing the same type of pattern is more as we get southern or south of that area, in portions of Kansas, most of Missouri, outside of that northern area along the Iowa border. It looks a little bit drier. And again, down in that southern Delta regions, that drier pattern, it looks like it's going to continue down there, at least over the next week. When we go out a little bit further from that, you know, we can start looking at what the seasonal drought outlook is looking like. And that's already a couple weeks old from when it came out on June 15th. But what we are seeing is on the seasonal drought outlook, it is still showing that through much of the eastern Corn Belt and even into the upper Midwest, we are like looking at drought development likely, and even those areas that are currently in drought, we're seeing that persisting, and this has taken us all the way through the end of September with that seasonal drought outlook. It does show that more of the western Corn Belt is maybe going to see a wetter pattern, maybe even some more of that drought removal in some of those areas, and that's through much of Kansas and Nebraska, western Iowa, and even northwest Missouri.
Brian,
But
take a few minutes now and talk about the 2023 drought. And I mean, if you're in the Western Corn Belt, you could probably say 2021, 2022, and 2023. I want to take a look at the drought here now across the Corn Belt, compare that to what we saw in 2012. How would you compare the two areas of drought kind of in a regional basis?
yeah, and after going through that 2012 drought, there were some similar makeups to how that drought really started in 2012. And as I'm talking here, I'm pulling up the map for the same time back in June of 2012, so I can just look at this. And yeah, so back in 2012, one thing that really stood out, and this was through pretty much all of the Corn Belt, was just how warm the spring was. We had a early green up that year. Temperatures in March were approaching 75, 80 degrees, depending on where you were in the region. And what we saw that year was, conditions were really good for getting the crop going, but we tapped in again. I'm going to mention soil moisture. We tapped into that soil moisture profile quite early that year, and we started losing moisture in the soil quite early that year because of just how warm the spring was, and even before some of the crop was in the ground. So we started seeing some of this drought developing in the Eastern Corn Belt at that time. Much of that was through Southern Illinois into Indiana, parts of Ohio, Southern Missouri, Western Kentucky. That was really the core of the region that we were seeing the drought developing up until this time of year. And even during this time of year, I remember the drought outlook for that time really hadn't pegged much of that drought developing at all during that time period. So much of us were kind of going into the 4th of July weekend, and we're like, well, we know it's dry, we have some drought, but it looked, all indications were pointing to it was not going to turn into what it did. After the 4th of July, the heat really set in. We started seeing that drought migrate westward into the more of the central and western Corn Belt. And we saw pretty much the entire region blowing up with drought early on in July. So comparing that to this year, again, we are seeing some of that indication in the Eastern Corn Belt, but not as intense or severe as we saw back in 2012. And again, even with the indications of drought developing further into the region and maybe intensifying in some of the areas that we're already seeing drought, the indication is not showing that this is going to encompass the entire Corn Belt. So again, the Western Corn Belt is looking much better. And for those that remember back in 2012, by the end of summer and early fall, the Western Corn Belt really was the core area of the drought. That we had a tropical system come up out of the Gulf of Mexico and pretty much ride the Mississippi River all the way up into the Midwest. And that was in August and September. We had a couple events that kind of really helped tamper some of that drought in 2012. But at the same time, more of the central and western Corn Belt really exploded with drought. And compared to what we have now, the ongoing drought in Kansas and Nebraska, that's been in place. You mentioned that we could go back even a couple of years in some of those areas and say, this dryness has been lingering, it's been ongoing. And even the areas that we're seeing in parts of Missouri right now, into parts of Iowa and even Illinois, where we have severe and even some extreme drought in there right now. The indications are that, precipitation should be adequate enough that even if we see this drought persist, we probably are not going to see the intensification like we did in 2012. We may see pockets of that depending on, again, we've had a lot of hit and miss rainfall this year, and we may see those pockets developing where some areas just continue to miss out.
Do you think right now, Brian, that end of June, that this is the worst drought? The 2023 time period right now is worse than where we were 11 years ago?
Looking at where we were 11 years ago, and especially on the Drought Monitor map, I would say that again, it depends on where you were. If you were in Southern Illinois, Southeast Missouri in 2012, you probably would say that it was worse back then, or even in parts of Indiana right now. But right now, when you compare where we were in 2012 across a lot of Illinois, a lot of Iowa, northern Missouri, eastern Nebraska, you would say that right now is probably worse. And so again, temperatures are going to play a key part in that. And again, I think we really tapped into that soil moisture quite early back in 2012. And looking at the map 2 weeks from now and how that drought really exploded in 2012, I think a lot of that was accumulation of tapping into the soil moisture early in 2012, and also the temperatures that we saw. So things really did take off after the 1st of July back in 2012.
Brian, as we wrap up, any final thoughts?
I think what's been interesting this year has been the weather patterns that we're seeing, and we haven't had a lot of those large thunderstorm complexes, mesoscale convective complexes, MCSs that we call them in the meteorology world. And a lot of those typically will develop in the plains, and they'll get going, and you'll see them go all the way through the Midwestern states and bringing those rain events. This year's been a lot more of that hit and miss, and I think that's kind of why we're seeing the drought developing kind of in these pockets again. And I think that has been kind of the theme so far. Now, again, the outlooks are showing for more widespread precipitation, so again, we're going to have to pay attention to that. And then also, as we hit those critical periods, first for corn in July, later in August with soybeans, just what are conditions looking like when we do hit those periods?
Brian Fuchs, an author of the US Drought Monitor with the National Drought Mitigation Center, with us today. Hey, Brian, appreciate the insight. Thanks for kind of going in depth on the drought situation across areas of the Corn Belt today.
Yes, great to be on, and always good to talk with you.
All righty. Once again, Brian Fuchs with us here on Brownfield. I'm Kellen Habekin. Thanks for watching.